My name is Rowan Ellis, and I was 29 years old the Sunday evening. My parents sat me down at the dinner table in the house where I grew up and told me, with the particular confidence of people who have been practicing a speech, that I was a disappointment to everything the Ellis family stood for, and that my grandfather had been foolish to waste his affection on someone who had never amounted to anything. My grandfather, Gerald Ellis, had died 6 years earlier. The dinner had started normally enough, if dinner with my parents could be called normal, which it could not with any honesty. My mother, Patricia, had made the pot roast she made for significant occasions, which told me before anyone said anything that this was not simply a grief meal but an occasion of some kind. My father, Robert, had poured wine at the beginning, rather than waiting until halfway through, which was his tell when he was bracing himself for something he intended to say and wanted a layer of social lubrication in place before he said it. I had driven 2 hours to be there because my grandfather had died, and because whatever complicated feelings I had about my parents, the obligation of grief operated on a different circuit than the one that managed our relationship. I had barely finished my first plate when my father set down his fork with the specific deliberateness of someone's making a symbolic gesture and said, "Rowan, we need to talk about what happens now with the estate." I said I was listening. He said that Gerald's estate would be going through probate and that as Gerald's only child, he, Robert, was the primary beneficiary, which meant that the distribution of assets would reflect Robert's judgment about where those assets were best directed. I said I wasn't sure what that had to do with me. My mother said, "It has to do with you because your grandfather had certain ideas about you that weren't realistic, and now that he's gone, those ideas don't need to be indulged anymore." I asked what she meant. My father said that Gerald had told him, multiple times over the years, that he intended to leave me something significant from his estate directly, bypassing Robert in a specific request that he believed I had earned through my relationship with him. He said that this intention, whatever Gerald had believed he was going to do, was not something that the estate planning actually reflected, and that since Robert was the primary beneficiary and executor, what happened with the estate was Robert's decision. Then my mother said the thing that I have thought about every day since, not because it was the worst thing I had ever heard, but because of the timing of it, 6 days after my grandfather's death, over pot roast with the wine glass in her hand. She said, "The truth is, Rowan, you've never been what your grandfather believed you were. He saw potential in you that simply wasn't there. You've never built anything, never achieved anything, never contributed anything to this family that warranted the kind of special treatment he wanted to give you. We're being honest with you because you deserve honesty, even if it's uncomfortable. You're 30 years old and you're not remarkable, and your grandfather's affection for you was a kindness he didn't need to extend, and that you certainly didn't earn." I sat at that table for a moment after she finished. Then I said I needed some air, and I walked out of the house and drove 2 hours home and sat in my apartment until well past midnight before I was able to sleep. 11 days later, a lawyer named Augusta Venn called my cell phone and asked if I could come to her office on Thursday because she had documents from Gerald Ellis's estate that required my attention. Welcome to Calm Drama Stories, where the quiet ones finally get heard. This channel is for the people who answer cruelty with calm and shame with the truth. If that sounds like your life, you are exactly where you belong. Subscribe, drop a comment, and stay with me. Because this story starts with the cruelest dinner I have ever sat through and ends with a folder that my grandfather had spent 3 years making sure would eventually be opened in exactly the right room. Before any of this, there was my grandfather. Gerald Ellis had spent 40 years as a civil engineer who transitioned, in his 50s, into land development, buying parcels of raw land in the Midwest and holding them with the patience of someone who understood that value was a function of time as much as location. He was not flashy about his success in the specific way of men who built things before the era of personal branding, who considered displaying wealth a form of poor taste, and who lived modestly by choice rather than by necessity. He drove the same truck for 12 years. He owned 3 suits that he wore in rotation. He kept his money in places that compounded quietly while he talked about the weather and the price of seed corn at the diner, where he had coffee every weekday morning for 30 years. He was my father's father, and the distance between them was one of those family distances that doesn't require a specific incident to explain, simply the accumulation of incompatibility between a man who built things carefully over time and a son who had always wanted the result without the process. My father was not a bad person in the way that requires malice. He was a person who had grown up in the shadow of a capable and self-sufficient father, and had never fully resolved his feelings about that shadow, which expressed itself across their relationship as a kind of ambient resentment that looked, from the outside, like ordinary tension and felt, from the inside of the family, like something more corrosive. My grandfather and I had found each other when I was about 12, which is an odd age to forge the primary relationships of your childhood, but perhaps not so odd when you consider what was available at 12 in the Ellis household. My parents' marriage was functional in the way of a machine that produces no product, but runs continuously, all process and no output, and I had been the child who sat at the edge of that machine trying to understand what it was for. Gerald had taken me to job sites. He had explained to me, patiently and without condescension, what soil surveys were and why they mattered, and how you read a topographic map, and what the relationship between water drainage and land value actually looked like over a 30-year horizon. He had given me, in the hundreds of hours we spent together through my teenage years, a framework for understanding how things were built and sustained over time that I did not fully understand I had received until I was an adult and could look back at the shape of my own thinking. I was not, by my parents' accounting, remarkable. I had not become a doctor or a lawyer or a business executive. I had spent my 20s working in urban planning for a mid-sized city's development office, the kind of unglamorous government work that nobody mentions at dinner parties, but that required exactly the combination of technical knowledge, patience, and long horizon thinking that my grandfather had spent my teenage years instilling in me. I made a decent salary. I lived modestly. I found the work genuinely interesting and believed it mattered, which was not a combination my parents had ever found impressive. My grandfather had visited my office once, 2 years before he died, and had spent 3 hours going through the city's comprehensive land use plan with me, asking questions that were sharper and more informed than the questions my colleagues twice my age sometimes asked. And at the end of it, he had put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Rowan, you understand this the way I understand it, which is the way it actually works, rather than the way people think it works, and there is not enough of that in the world." I had carried that with me. Through the Sunday dinners at my parents' house, where my job was described as being a mid-level government bureaucrat. Through the family gatherings where my cousins' careers in finance and medicine and corporate law were recounted with pride while my work was mentioned briefly and moved past. Through the years of being the Ellis who hadn't quite gotten there, wherever there was supposed to be. My grandfather had never treated me as the Ellis who hadn't quite gotten there. He had treated me as the Ellis who had gotten exactly where he recognized, and that recognition had been the steadiest thing in my adult life, the ground under everything else. He died in February, at 81, from pneumonia that compounded existing cardiac issues and moved faster than anyone had prepared for. I had visited him the week before he died, and he had been tired but clear, and we had talked about a land parcel he had been following in the county north of us that he thought had interesting long-term potential. He had made me promise to look into it for my own analysis after he was gone. He said, "See what I saw, and then you'll understand why I watched it for 15 years. He died on a Tuesday. I drove 2 hours to my parents' house for the dinner. On Sunday, the lawyer called on the following Thursday. I need to tell you what I knew about my grandfather's estate before the call, because what I knew and what my parents had told me were not the same picture. I knew from conversations over the years that had never been presented as formal estate discussions, but that had accumulated into a fairly clear sense of his intentions, that my grandfather had done well with his land development work. He had never told me numbers, which was consistent with his general discretion about money, but he had mentioned parcels and holdings and long-term positions in ways that suggested his net worth was substantially more than his lifestyle implied. He had told me once in a conversation I had not fully known how to process at 25 when it happened, that he had made arrangements to make sure I had a real foundation to build from, and that I should not worry about money in the way young people sometimes worried about it when they were doing meaningful work that didn't pay as much as other work might. He said it the way he said things he had thought carefully about, directly and without elaboration, expecting the statement to be sufficient. I had thanked him and moved on, the way you move on when someone tells you something you want to believe, but can't quite let yourself fully accept. My parents had told me at the Sunday dinner that Gerald's estate would reflect Robert's judgment because Robert was the primary beneficiary and executor. The framing had been clear. Whatever Gerald had told me, whatever he had intended, the estate planning hadn't formalized it, and since Robert controlled the estate, Robert's priorities would govern. What my parents did not know, as I would learn on Thursday, was that Gerald had not been careless about his estate planning. Gerald had been, if anything, more careful about his estate planning than about anything else he had done in the final 3 years of his life, and the care he had taken had been specifically designed to account for the precise scenario my parents had outlined at that dinner table. He had known his son, he had planned accordingly. Augusta Venn's office was in a converted Victorian house in the downtown district of the county seat where my grandfather had lived, the kind of office that signals permanence and seriousness through the quality of its woodwork, rather than through modern signage or reception desks with screens. She had a waiting room with 2 leather chairs, and a table with a chess set on it that looked like it was used rather than decorative. And she came out herself when I arrived, shook my hand, and said she was glad I had been able to come. She was in her early 60s with the particular directness of someone who had spent decades doing legally complex work for clients who needed clarity more than comfort, and who had developed a manner that delivered clarity first and comfort as a natural consequence of it. She said before we sat down that she wanted me to know something about how this meeting had come to be. She said that Gerald Ellis had been her client for 22 years, and that in the 3 years before his death, he had met with her more frequently and with more specific intent than in any previous period of their professional relationship. She said he had been deliberate and clear and had asked her, on more than one occasion, to confirm that what he was putting in place would hold up to any challenge his son might bring, and that she had confirmed it each time with the same answer, that what Gerald had built was built correctly and would hold. She said she had been his attorney long enough to understand why he was asking that question, and that she had taken extra care with the documentation precisely because she had understood why it mattered. Then she sat me down across from her desk, and she opened the folder. Why Grandfather's Estate, as documented in the trust and with instruments Augusta laid out for me over the following 90 minutes, was structured with the specificity of someone who had spent 40 years understanding how things were built to last. His primary vehicle was a revocable trust that had become irrevocable at his death, established 7 years before he died and amended twice, in the 3 years before his death with increasingly precise language. The trust held the majority of his assets, which meant they passed outside of probate entirely, directly to the beneficiaries he had designated, without going through the estate process that my father, as executor of the will, would have controlled. This was the structural decision that changed everything, though I did not understand its full significance until Augusta explained it. My father had been told he was the primary beneficiary of the will. This was technically accurate. The will did leave its assets to Robert Ellis as primary beneficiary, but the will, by the time of Gerald's death, held very little. The land parcels, the investment accounts, the financial instruments that represented the overwhelming majority of Gerald's net worth had been transferred into the trust over the preceding 7 years. What the will held was the personal property, the furniture, the truck, the household contents, the items my father had presumably been expecting to be a fraction of a much larger whole. The trust, which my father had apparently not known about in its full specificity, held everything else. Augusta said, "Your grandfather was very clear with me about his reasoning. He said he was not going to leave things to chance or to his son's discretion. He said he had watched his son for 50 years and he knew what discretion in Robert's hands would produce. He wanted the distribution to be mechanical, not advisory, which is why the trust structure was so important to him. She turned to the distribution section of the trust document. My grandfather had left a specific and substantial share of the trust's assets, expressed as a percentage rather than a fixed dollar amount, so that fluctuations in value would not erode the intended proportion to me. The percentage was 40% of the total trust assets, which Augusta said, based on the asset valuations she had conducted following his death, translated to a sum in the range of $800,000 across the land parcels and investment accounts and cash positions the trust held. She had also left a portion to a land conservation nonprofit he had supported for many years. She had left a portion to the church his wife had attended before her death, in memory of her. And she had left a portion to my father, calculated as a percentage that was meaningful and represented a genuine inheritance. But that was substantially less than the total he had apparently been expecting to control. I sat across from Augusta Venn with the trust document in my hands, and I reread the section that contained my name 3 times. Then I asked her a question that surprised her a little, because it was not the question most people asked when told they were receiving a significant inheritance. I asked her why he had done it this way, the trust structure, the mechanical distribution, the specific precautions. I asked whether he had said specifically what he was protecting against. Augusta was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much of a client's private reasoning to share with a beneficiary, even a beloved one. Then she said, "He told me that he had spent a lot of years watching his son take things from people who weren't paying attention, and that he was not going to let that happen to you. He said you were the only person in his family who understood what he had built and what it was for, and that the only fair thing was to make sure it got to you in a way that didn't depend on anyone else's good faith," she said. He also told me that he suspected his son would try to use the time between his death and any formal reading to frame things in a particular way, and that he specifically asked me to call you directly and promptly so that you heard the real picture from me before you heard a distorted version from anyone else. She said, "He said to tell you something specific, if I thought the timing was right." She handed me an envelope. My name was on the front in his handwriting. I opened the envelope that evening in my apartment, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of water I kept meaning to drink and forgetting about. My grandfather's letter was 3 pages, handwritten on the yellow legal paper he had always used for anything he considered important enough to write by hand rather than type, and it began with the same directness he had brought to every conversation we had ever had. He said he was sorry for the family I had been given, and that he was not sorry for the relationship we had built inside of it, because the relationship we had built was one of the things in his life he was most proud of, and he did not give out that particular pride lightly. He said he had known for a long time that his son would attempt to control his estate in a way that did not reflect his actual wishes, and that he had spent 3 years making sure that what he intended would happen regardless of what Robert intended. He said he was not angry at his son in a way that required punishment, but that he was clear about what Robert was capable of and had structured things accordingly, the way you structure a building, to accommodate the loads it will actually face, rather than the loads you wish it would face. He said he had watched me for 30 years, from the child sitting at the edge of his parents' incomprehensible marriage to the adult doing work that mattered in a city planning office that nobody thought to be impressed by, and that what he had seen was someone who understood what things were actually worth rather than what they appeared to be worth, which was rarer than any credential. He said the land parcel in the county north of us, the one he had asked me to look into, was one of the trust's holdings and was now mine as part of my distribution. He said he had been watching it for 15 years and had believed for the past 5 of them that it was within a decade of significant value, and that he thought I would see what he saw in it and would be patient with it the way it deserved. He said, "Rowan, I need you to know that everything your parents told you about yourself was a story they needed to tell to make their own situation feel rational. Stories people need to tell are not facts. You know what you know, and you can do what you can do. And I have watched you do it, and I am not confused about what it is worth." I said he loved me. He signed it the way he signed his land contracts, with his full name and a small drawing of a topographic contour line that he had doodled on documents for as long as I could remember. A private joke about the foundation of everything. I sat with that letter for a long time. My father called me the following Saturday, which was 9 days after the dinner, and 2 days after my meeting with Augusta Venn, which told me that Augusta had also, at some point, been in communication with him about the trust's existence and structure, which would have been a communication very different from the one I imagined he had been expecting to receive. He did not open with an apology. He opened with what I recognized from a lifetime of listening to him as the tone he used when he was reframing a situation he had lost control of. The smooth, reasonable tone that meant the previous framing had not worked and he was installing a new one. He said that he had not been fully informed about all of the details of Gerald's estate planning, which was technically a description of a factual situation and also the blandest possible characterization of what had occurred. He said that family dynamics were complicated and that things had been said at dinner that were said in the context of stress and grief, and that he hoped I would interpret them with the generosity that family members extended to each other in difficult moments. I said I had heard what was said at dinner very clearly and had not found it ambiguous in a way that grief and stress explained. He said he hoped we could move forward and that there was a lot of complexity still to work through with the estate. I said Augusta Venn had explained the structure to me and that I did not anticipate the distribution being complex, given how carefully it had been organized. There was a pause that lasted long enough to be informative. He said that he wasn't sure Gerald had been fully in his right mind in the final years, that the level of estate planning Augusta had described to him was unusual, and that he was considering whether a challenge might be appropriate. I want to tell you what I felt when he said that, because I think it matters. I felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite sadness, but something in between. The feeling you get when something you have been dreading turns out to be something you were fully prepared for. I said that Augusta had mentioned he might consider that, and that she had also mentioned, when I asked, that the trust had been structured and documented with that specific concern in mind, and that Gerald had executed capacity evaluations with his physician at each of the two amendment dates specifically to create a contemporaneous record, and that she was confident the trust would hold against any challenge. Another pause. He said he supposed there was not much point in pursuing something that would cost more than it produced. I said that was his decision to make. We talked for 3 more minutes about nothing consequential, and then the call ended, and I set my phone down on my kitchen table, and I sat with the quiet of my apartment for a while before I made dinner. I want to tell you about my father's challenge because he did file one, despite what he had said on the phone, and because what happened with it reflects something I think matters. The challenge was filed 6 weeks after the trust's existence became clear to him, through a probate attorney named Martin Greer, who argued that Gerald had lacked testamentary capacity at the time of the trust's most recent amendment, that Augusta Venn had exercised undue influence over her client, and that the trust's unusual departure from the expected structure of leaving everything to his son constituted evidence that something improper had occurred. Augusta was not alarmed by the filing. She told me, in the call she made to let me know it had been filed, that she had been expecting it and that the documentation in place was precisely designed for this. She said the capacity evaluations my grandfather had undergone at his physician's office at each amendment date, the contemporaneous notes in his physician's records describing him as oriented, clear, and fully capable of understanding complex legal arrangements, combined with the notes Augusta herself had kept of their meetings and the reasoning he had expressed for the trust's structure, formed a record that Martin Greer was going to find very difficult to argue against. She also said something that my grandfather had apparently told her to say to me if a challenge was filed. She said he had told her that if Robert challenged the trust, she should tell me that this was exactly what he had planned for and that I should be patient because the challenge would not succeed and what came after it would be cleaner than what came before. The challenge did not succeed. The hearing, which took place 4 months after the filing, involved Augusta presenting the capacity documentation. My grandfather's physician testifying about the evaluations and his clear and consistent understanding of the trust's provisions and their reasoning, and two of my grandfather's longtime business associates testifying about their regular professional contact with him in the period before his death and their observation of his mental clarity and deliberateness during that time. Martin Greer's strongest argument was that the trust's departure from conventional inheritance patterns was itself evidence of irregularity. The judge, a woman named Harriet Souza, who had clearly reviewed the documentation carefully before the hearing, asked Martin Greer directly whether he was arguing that a person could not legally depart from conventional inheritance patterns or whether he was arguing that something improper had occurred in this specific case. Martin Greer said he was arguing the latter. Judge Souza said the documentation in support of Gerald Ellis's capacity and independent judgment was among the most thorough she had reviewed in an estate challenge, and that the trust's structure, far from indicating irregularity, appeared to reflect exactly the kind of careful and informed planning that competent estate attorneys facilitated for clients with specific and legitimate reasons for non-conventional distribution. She denied the challenge. The trust was administered as my grandfather had written it. I want to tell you about the land parcel in the county north of us, because my grandfather had asked me to look into it, and I did. And what I found when I looked into it was the last thing he taught me. The parcel was 340 acres of agricultural land, with drainage patterns that, when I obtained and analyzed the county's soil survey and topographic data, showed characteristics consistent with land that would become significantly more valuable as suburban development expanded northward from the city over the next 15 to 20 years. My grandfather had purchased it 19 years earlier for a price that reflected its purely agricultural value at the time. He had held it patiently across nearly 2 decades without any development action, simply waiting for the horizon he had seen to move closer. I had it appraised after the trust was distributed. The current value was approximately 4 times what he had paid for it, and the appraiser's commentary noted that the parcel's strategic location relative to projected development corridors gave it strong appreciation potential over the coming decade. He had been watching it for 15 years by the time he told me about it the week before he died. He had been right about what he saw in it when he bought it 19 years before that. I sat with the appraisal report for a long time, thinking about the conversation in his office 2 years before his death, where he had said I understood things the way they actually worked rather than the way people thought they worked. He had been teaching me to see what he saw for 17 years. And then he had given me the thing he had been watching longest, not as a windfall, but as a lesson, with a 30-acre demonstration attached. I have not sold it. I have held it the way he held it, which is to say, with patience and with confidence in the horizon, checking the development corridor reports quarterly, following the county's comprehensive planning updates with the attention my job has given me, watching what he taught me to watch. I will know when the time is right. He taught me how to know. My relationship with my parents has not recovered. And I want to be honest with you about that because I think pretending otherwise would be dishonest in a way that does a disservice to the actual story. My mother called once, about 5 months after the trust was distributed and the challenge had been denied. She said she had been thinking about what was said at dinner, and that some of it had come out more harshly than she intended, and that she hoped I understood it had been said under the stress of grief. I said I did not understand it that way, and that I had thought about it carefully enough to be confident in my understanding. She said she hoped we could find a way to move forward. I said I was open to a relationship that began with an honest accounting of what had happened rather than a request to characterize what had happened as something it wasn't. She said she thought I was being rigid. I said I thought I was being accurate, and that those were different things. We have spoken twice since then. Briefly and on occasions, my grandmother's generation would have recognized as the obligatory ones. The conversations are correct and careful and contain nothing that matters, which is, I have decided, the form the relationship will take for the foreseeable future. and I have made a peace with that which does not require me to pretend it is anything other than what it is. My grandmother, my grandfather's wife, who predeceased him by 4 years, had been gone long enough that she was not part of this story except in the ways she was always present in my grandfather's reasoning. The church bequest in the trust in her memory, the piece of her jewelry that appeared in his personal effects and that he had left to Augusta Venn with a note asking her to make sure it got to her to the right person. Augusta gave me the note. It said simply, "For whoever kept the real books, I have the jewelry, I have the letter. I have the land parcel in the county north of us, and the patience my grandfather spent 30 years teaching me to apply to things worth waiting for." I want to tell you about the Thursday afternoon of the lawyer's call, 8 months after the dinner, in a different way than I have told it so far, because I think the texture of it matters. I drove to Augusta's office on a cold February morning, parking in the lot behind the Victorian house and sitting in my car for a moment before I went in. Not because I was uncertain about anything, but because I was aware that I was about to enter a room where something my grandfather had spent 3 years preparing was going to be presented, and that preparation deserved a moment of acknowledgement before it became something I was simply experiencing. He had spent 3 years making sure this moment happened correctly. He had met with Augusta regularly, amended the trust twice, undergone capacity evaluations he almost certainly found tedious, documented his reasoning in ways that would survive challenge, written the letter I would read that evening, told Augusta what to say to me and when, identified the land parcel, and made sure I knew to look for it. 3 years of careful, deliberate, patient construction aimed at a moment he would not be alive to see, all for the purpose of making sure that something he believed was right would actually come to pass. When I walked into Augusta's office and she opened the folder, I was not simply receiving an inheritance. I was receiving the product of 3 years of my grandfather's final, careful work, the last project he designed and executed with the same attention to structure and foundation that had characterized everything he had built before it. I thought about the dinner table, my mother's voice steady and certain, my father's practiced framing of a situation he had believed he controlled. The pot roast and the wine and the 12-year-old Rowan I had apparently remained in their accounting. The Ellis who hadn't quite gotten there, whose grandfather's affection was a kindness that hadn't been earned and didn't need to be indulged now that the one offering it was gone. What they had not known was that the kindness had been put in trust, that it had been structured and documented and legally protected specifically, because my grandfather had known his son well enough to know what the alternative would look like. That it had been designed to survive exactly the dinner I had just sat through and to arrive, intact and complete, in Augusta Venn's office 11 days later. He had built it the way he built everything, for the loads it would actually face. Here is what I want you to carry from this story. If you have a relationship with an older person that is meaningful and specific and real, and that relationship exists within a family that has complicated feelings about it, do not assume that the family's account of that person's intentions is accurate. Do not assume that because you are the one described as less important or less remarkable or less deserving by the people around you, that this is the account that the person who actually knows you would give. The accounts of our worth that we absorb from families are not objective. They serve purposes that have nothing to do with accuracy and everything to do with the family's internal dynamics and the specific needs of the people telling them. My parents' account of me as the Ellis who hadn't quite gotten there served a function in their understanding of themselves and their family's hierarchy that had nothing to do with what my grandfather actually saw when he looked at me. He looked at me and saw someone who understood how things were built and how they lasted. That was not remarkable by most people's accounting. It was exactly right by his. I also want to tell you something about the legal side of this, because knowledge is protection. My grandfather protected his intentions through a trust structure that bypassed the probate process his son controlled. This is a legitimate and entirely legal estate planning strategy that attorneys can execute for anyone whose estate includes family complications that make conventional will-based distribution risky. If you are an older person with specific intentions about where your estate should go, and you are not fully confident that your executor will carry out those intentions faithfully, An estate attorney can help you build a structure that makes the distribution mechanical rather than discretionary. If you are a younger person who has been told what a deceased person's estate contained or intended, you have the right to verify that account. Probate records are public. Trust documents are not public, but beneficiaries have legal standing to receive their documentation directly from the trustee or the attorney. You do not need to accept someone else's characterization of what a person intended if you have reason to believe that characterization might not be complete. Pull the records. Call the attorney. Ask the questions. My grandfather spent 3 years making sure Augusta Venn would call me directly and promptly, so that I heard the truth before I heard the distortion. Not everyone has a Gerald Ellis in their corner, but everyone has the ability to ask. I still go to the diner where my grandfather had coffee every weekday morning for 30 years. Not every day, but regularly, the way things worth continuing get continued. The woman who runs the counter there recognized me the first time I came in after his death, and she said, "You're Jerry's grandson, aren't you?" And I said, "Granddaughter." Yeah. And she said, "Right. He talked about you all the time. You work in planning over at the city." And I said, "Yes." She said he was real proud of you. Said you understood land the way not many people your age did anymore. I said I had a good teacher. She poured my coffee and moved on down the counter, and I sat with it for a while before I had to leave for work. He had been coming to that diner for 30 years. He had talked about me to the woman at the counter. He had told her what I did and been proud of it in the specific and unspectacular way that mattered. The way pride works when it doesn't require an audience because it's simply how you feel. That is the inheritance that came before the trust documents and will outlast them. The knowledge that someone who saw me clearly, and liked what they saw, and made sure I knew it, and built something that would survive the people who would have told me otherwise. The folder is open, the documents are distributed, the land parcel is being watched, and somewhere in the configuration of what my grandfather built and what he taught me, I understand, more fully than I have understood anything, that remarkable was never the right word for what he was trying to tell me. The word was worth it. All of it. Every year of it. Worth it. Drop a comment below. Tell me your story or tell me you're here. If this reminded you of someone who believed in you more clearly than the people closest to you did, go do something today that honors what they saw. And if this reminded you to have a conversation